There's a general pattern in natural philosophy and indeed in logic, uh, the study of logic, to unify uh, things that are explained differently in a common way to create a unifying description. So, for example, if I can explain why this pen falls and how fast it falls, great. If I can explain how the moon moves, a circle around the earth, it's an old explanation, great. But a unifying system is one that could explain both of those. And that's very different things. You know, in an ordinary human experience, the moon going through the sky, it could easily have an entirely different set of explanations. Of course, we know Newton did exactly that, explain why this falls, why the moon goes around, and a great many other things with his mechanics, as did the other natural philosophers. Now, in philosophy, it is really no different. We have a lot of specialized knowledge, and this is possible because through trial and error, basically, at least just to epitomize the process, through trial and error, human beings come up with sets of heuristics, and these heuristics get refined and abstracted themselves, and they don't necessarily become a material explanation naturally, but they do become more abstract and more like something that's meant to be this explanation as opposed to just a heuristic, a rule of thumb that was discovered by trial and error and is not really explained in terms of why it works. Now, when you describe a system in terms of your new abstraction, if there was any accuracy to your old way of describing that, like maybe we didn't know about the force of gravity, but we said, hey, things always drop. So that was our explanation. They just always drop. It's a rule of the universe. Separate rule from, the moon goes around the earth. When you have your abstraction that's going to express it, that old description, again, to the degree that it was accurate in some sense or some part, will be a special case of your new abstraction. And this is what physicists have been doing the whole time, especially Einstein, and I think his influence is great there on sort of establishing that what you do is you seek new abstractions to explain things that are considered different cases, and you take the different cases and you turn them into special cases. There's certain techniques to always approach and get a first rough estimate for such a thing. You can take the mathematics of the two different systems if they're mathematical, and there's ways to combine them with brute force using higher dimensionality. Of course, it's nice to combine them without resorting to just mathematical tricks which complicate things. But in philosophy, I seek to do the same thing, and to me, there has been a major unification for me personally between relativism and progressivism. And the reason is that in relativism, as in all skepticism, you cannot say what a thing is in itself. If you want to say, am I a good person, you would have to say relative to what? I can't just assess the goodness level in an app, it's 5, and somebody else has 4. Right. You could take tallies, and those tallies, you can rely on them. You can put people in jail for them. You could do lots of things and base your actions on them. But fundamentally, for relativists, I'm not arguing you should believe this. I'm saying relativists don't understand things in terms of things in themselves. We understand them in terms of relationships. And in the material arena, in materialism, those relationships are energy. A photon is essentially a relationship between the emitter and the absorber. One way to look at it. So we don't judge a thing in itself. We can't say, is this cup hot? Is this cup cold? We say, is it hotter or colder than something else that we can compare it to? Right. So someone like me, I think it's interesting to ask, what's the sum? If we added up everybody's happiness and misery, would there be more happiness or more misery? Could you even balance them? Are they opposite? Does happiness make up for misery? Is it a sum total zero? Is it balanced on one side or the other? Is there any rules, or is it arbitrary and we can invent the distribution we like? Those could be interesting questions, fun questions, mostly because of the topics that are touched on. But none of those questions can be answered in relativism because, insofar, rather, as they are questions of something in itself, judging a thing in itself. I don't think there really is a sum total, and the concept of the sum total is it doesn't have a material correspondent. There isn't a sum total. It's the wrong way of looking at the universe, thinking you could sum total things like that. And the closest thing to that kind of sum total that you could have is each person taking a sum total and then adding a sum total in a multidimensional way that doesn't erase the individual answers. And then you could call that your sum total, but there's various problems with that. One, how do you sum such an infinite thing? How do you take into account points of view that don't exist yet? In other words, people that haven't been born yet. And then you have to address the fact that people are not fully informed. So the sum total involves different people having different facts. It's a very complex sum total, at best. But interesting to talk about because, hey, we want to know whether our society is doing well or not. But really, we take those sum metrics so we could compare them to similarly calculated by a similar methodology, or the same, ideally, methodology of a different time or different people or a different circumstance. And we compare. Okay. So relativists believe we can compare, and you can invent criteria, and though there's a freedom to that, you can describe what your criterion is relating to. So for example, if my criteria of goodness is that it helps me survive, poison isn't good and sunlight is good, right? And I've related that to a material situation. Now you could say, but you can't insist that the quality of goodness applies to survival. No, I can only say that for a period of reasoning, I've adopted that criteria. And then that allows me to make comparisons. And it's like, well, when are you going to get back to proving that you're absolutely right? Never. I'm getting to a point where I can justify action, where I can justify, self-justify, and potentially to others, my actions. And by this criteria, I can judge if I think something is better or worse based on certain criteria. I can argue for certain criteria is somehow more fundamental. Like the criteria of what I enjoy in terms of art, to me that's subsidiary to the criteria of survival. Now I think people sometimes use criteria other than survival, even when survival was the obvious criteria to use, meaning their survival was at risk. They certainly think of other criteria when they didn't realize they were risking their life, doing some risky behavior just for fun, not thinking that they could kill them. Okay. So survival is an easily argued criteria because it's widely shared, not just among humans, but among all living things. Let's meet up here. But fundamentally, that doesn't matter. You're just choosing the criteria. You can't say what something is in and of itself, but you can say it's better or worse according to your criteria, and you can explain that criteria and how it relates to the material world. And that means you can make progress. Right, because you can take two situations, see which one you think is better by that criteria, and then move. Progress doesn't mean it's actually getting better. It means that it's in a consistent direction. It means you're not going in a circle. It could be into a worse direction. It could be into a direction where things get worse and better. Maybe there's some other kind of cycle, but you are not going through exactly the same situation. So to me, relativism determines that I be progressive, some sort of progressive. I consider myself a libertarian, a progressive libertarian, because I believe in incrementally achieving liberty, individual liberty. I believe in visualizing. Progressive libertarians believe, I know this because I'm the only one that I've ever heard of, believe in visualizing an idealized future And then taking small incremental steps, not necessarily small, but incremental, towards that. Okay. If we have a chance to take the whole step, probably won't do that because we want time to reevaluate the criteria and thus the goal and the way we measure. We expect some wandering in this progress. There's a method by which there is progress, but it still wanders, and it's not entirely guaranteed not to be circular if you allow yourself too much scripting of the criteria. I just thought it was stopped on me. It was at 10 minutes, but this one goes up higher. So philosophy, politics, logic, they become an art form of how to play with all the vectors, you know, the criteria, which is like a vector pointing in a particular direction, but only if you take your measurements correctly. You know, you could say, I want to go with a better man. Maybe you didn't really decide who the better man was. Maybe there was a problem with your criteria, or maybe your criteria was fine, but you didn't have all the facts. So it becomes a juggling of all these vectors, the directions implied by your biases and your conscious intent and the subliminal logical necessities involved with the way you've structured your goals that may not be apparent to you. And we're trying to balance these in order to find progress in some direction. Right, so you could be a progressive waritarian. You believe we need to have a more warlike state. We need to go back when there's this feudal kingdoms just having constant wars for show, fun, and profit. But I don't see how you couldn't want progress of some sort unless you think things are perfect the way they are right now. Right? But that's just me, and that's based on the fact that I'm a relativist, and I either have to accept the way things are right now, which as a relativist, you know, I can't necessarily work with that. Why? Because how are they right now? You know, I could compare it to history, that I see things better, I see things worse. So all I really know is that just in principle, I see areas where my criteria of judgment could be satisfied better. So since I can't judge right now if things are good enough to stop, and my philosophy says I'll never actually be able to make that judgment if it's good enough to stop, we'll simply always continue trying to make things better. And if we run out of obvious things like less slavery, less starvation, you know, more health care, you know, we can worry about, hey, we need another criteria of better, or better is to have, you know, no more of this program and just let people, it's good enough even though it's not perfect, let people go on individually. Because we've solved the social problems and now it's just that people have to decide what the rest. I don't know. As that's at best, most optimistically, thousands of years away, really would rather just focus on these obvious things that interfere with liberty. And those things are lack of social infrastructure, lack of, you know, health care, the tremendous trillions and trillions of dollars spent on war every day by day, year by year, century by century now. I just want to address those, and my criteria therefore are created to materially relate. They're designed, they're built from structures that relate to those issues that contradict my idealized future, which we may or may not achieve, and certainly would not achieve exactly, which is in the direction, a long off direction, to help me line up this little tiny era of criteria that I can have for a goal, to measure these little tiny steps. I need this little tiny vector, and to sight it right, I want to put something way out there, so it's very delicate to differences in angle. And thus are unified relativism in natural philosophy and relativism in politics.